Welcome back. Wednesday, May 19th, 2021. A friend and I were talking this morning and about books, conservative books. We got to talking about how in our movement, at least, we seem even now to care and read more about communism and socialism than terrorism. Is it possible this is because communism kills or has killed more? But then again, there are more Islamist and terrorist sponsoring countries than communist socialist countries, and this gets to a very, very interesting set of paradoxes and truths that not enough seem to grasp when it comes to the current conflict in the Middle East. Without communism, there is no terrorism, at least not as we understand it in the modern world. It is not an accident the Soviets helped found the most famous modern terrorist organization in the world, the PLO. As we've talked here and there about the Middle East and the communist influence of its base ideologies and operations, I've not gone into it deeply, though perhaps now is that time, given you see two other paradoxical yet true things going on. The most vociferous vitriol against the United States comes from the same set of talking points, minus the religious aspect, but in every other aspect, the same set of talking points used by socialists, communists, and terrorists. This, of course, helps explain why books found in terrorists' houses, like bin Laden's, include histories and commentaries on America by so many academic socialists and communists, like and including Noam Chomsky. Chomsky's narrative of America in the West, the 1619 narrative, was and is Al-Qaeda's as well. All of this especially revolves around the issues Nikita Khrushchev gave to the United Nations in the 1950s as the issues the Third World, revolutionary movements, including Islamist and Arab nationalist, and communism could unite. Those issues Khrushchev spelled out were colonialism, imperialism, and racism. What a great way to lump the luridities of the West, America, and her allies, including Israel, into one sphere of influence, and Marxism as the other, grabbing the growing Arab and Islamist movements at the time into the anti-American and anti-Western alliance they would become. Why else would Yasser Arafat work with the Soviets, the Castros, and oppose the United States and side with her enemies in every battle and war since the 1960s? Why else the unification of the malocracy of Iran with the communist movement in Venezuela? Why is the antagonism toward Israel, the wish for it to cease to exist, really? Why is that the loudest from the socialist communist political leaders in America, like Bernie Sanders, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, well outshadowing, well outspeaking anything white supremacist or considered right-wing? This squad plus Sanders, they, after all, they support LGBTQ rights, don't they? They, after all, support abortion rights, don't they? They, after all, support minority rights, don't they? And yet none of those exist in the Arab and Islamist world, and certainly not in the Palestinian territories, which is why those seeking abortions and those wanting to live in LGBTQ lifestyle and live in safety and live in the territories escape and try to escape to Israel to live freely and safely. Why is there such antagonism from this uber progressive crowd, then, for the country that embraces their agendas in all except the destruction of that country? And why is there such support from this uber-progressive crowd, then, for the movement that does not believe in voting, much less voting rights, gay rights, lesbian rights, religious freedom, or racial minority rights? The party is the answer. Marxist destruction and radical Marxist transformation trumps everything else. That's why. How else do you have good and reasonable people, so you thought, support monsters from the Castros to Mao? Same way you can see today reasonable-sounding people support the masters of Venezuela, even as their citizens' concept of going out to dinner is by dumpster diving. The party. Paul Berman is a man of great liberal credentials, professor of journalism, former writer for The New Republic and The Village Voice. His book, Liberalism and Terrorism, reaches far. I've read to you from his book before on other issues. I shall do so now in new respects. He writes, the 20th century wars were ideological in a double sense. There was the struggle of liberalism against its enemies, and there was the struggle of liberalism against its self. That is to say, there was always a doubt in the liberal movement as to whether the illiberal movement might be right, forcing a self-interrogation against itself within the liberal movement. The present conflict seems to me to be following the 20th century pattern exactly, with one variation. The anti-liberal side right now, instead of communist, Nazi, fascist, happens to be radical Arab nationalist and Islamic fundamentalist. Over the last several decades, a variety of movements have arisen in the Arab and Islamic countries, a radical nationalism, Ba'ath socialist, Marxist, pan-Arab, and so forth, and a series of Islamist movements, meaning Islamic fundamentalism in a political sense. The movements have varied hugely and have gone to war with one another, to be sure, just as Hitler and Stalin slugged it out too. But the Islamists give the impression of having wandered into modern life directly from the 13th century, and the Baathists and Marxists have tried to seem modern and yet even futuristic. Think of how they talk here in America about the future all the time. Green energy and the like. But all of those movements have followed, each in its own fashion, the 20th century pattern. They are anti-liberal insurgencies. They have identified a people of the good who are the Arabs or Muslims, just like the proletariat. They believe that their own societies have been infested with a hideous inner corruption which must be rooted out, a race or bourgeoisie. They observe that the inner infestation is supported by powerful external forces, group responsibility, and they gird their swords. Their thinking is apocalyptic. They imagine that at the end they too will succeed in establishing a block-like, unchanging society, freed of inner corruption, a purified society, the victory of good. They are the heirs of the 20th century totalitarians, though. It is worth remarking how often an antipathy for the Jews has recurred in these various movements over the years. Nazi paranoia about the Jews was an extreme case, but it would be a mistake to suppose that Nazism was alone in this. At the end of his life, Stalin, an anti-Nazi, is thought to have been likewise planning a general massacre of the Jews, of which the Doctor's plot was a foretaste. The Nazi paranoia, just like Stalin's, was owed strictly to ancient superstitions and especially to psychological fears, the fears that were sparked by the mere existence of a minority population that seemed incapable of blending into the seamless, block-like, perfect society of the future. The Arab radical and Islamist antipathy to the Jews naturally displays a somewhat different quality, given that, this time, the Jews do have a state of their own. And where there is power, conflicts are bound to be more than imaginary. Even so, how can it be that after 120 years of Arab Zionist conflict and more than 50 years of a Jewish state, the hostility to Israel seems to have remained constant? For Israel's borders have been broad, but have also been narrow. Its leaders have been hawkish, sometimes contemptuous, but have also been dovish and courteous. There have been West Bank settlements, and there have been no West Bank settlements. Proposals for common projects for mutual benefit, and no proposals. There have been times, such as the 1980s before the Russian immigration, when most of Israel's Jewish population consisted of people who fled to Israel from the Arab world itself, instead of from or to Europe. And not even then in a period when Israel in its dusky-skinned authenticity could claim to be a genuinely third world nation, not even then did the Israelis win any wider or warmer acceptance. And why was that, and why is it still? It is because the anti-Zionist hostility rests partly on the hard terrain of negotiable grievances, but mostly it goes floating along on the same airy currents of myth and dread that proved so irresistible to Nazis and communists in the past. The anti-Zionist hostility draws on a feeling that Arab and Islamic society has been polluted by an impure infestation that needs to be rooted out. The hostility draws, that is, on a lethal combination of utopian yearning and superstitious fear, the yearning for a new society cleansed of ethnic and religious difference, together with a fear of a diabolical minority population. Does that sound like an unfair or tendentious description of Middle Eastern anti-Zionism? The curses of the clerics, the earnest remarks of the presidents of Syria and other countries, the man in the street interviews that keep appearing in the press and on the radio, the sermons, they're not pretty to quote. Even now, the newspapers in parts of the Islamic world are full of stories still today claiming the World Trade Center was attacked by, of course, a Jewish conspiracy. And so the Arab and Islamic world burns with hatred for Israel, in part because of issues that are factual, but mostly because of issues that are phantasmagorical. No one should doubt that hatred for the United States likewise draws, in some degree, on real-life terrible things that America has done to the Muslim world. But to what degree? To what degree? The United States is resented for supporting Israel. But then again, President Clinton did spend 8 years trying to help the Palestinians negotiate a state, and hatred for the United States seems to have abated not one bit. Everyone agrees that America is loathed for its years of fighting against Saddam Hussein, yet there is reason to suppose that without military opposition from the United States, the dictator who slaughtered hundreds of thousands would go on with his slaughters, as he promised to do. Kurds, Shiites, corpses. Indeed, we might even reflect that every time the United States has taken up arms in the last generation, it was on behalf of Muslims. This seems to have done nothing to improve America's reputation in the world of the Islamists and the radical Arab nationalists. Again, it's not about human rights. It's not about colonialism. It's not about imperialism. It's not about racism. There were no worse racist countries than the Sudan during the Cold War and after. Countries Yasser Arafat and Osama bin Laden were comfortable and made homes in. There was no greater colonialism and imperialism that the Soviet invasions in Europe and Afghanistan and in Central America and Africa that did not cease receiving celebrations from those denouncing imperialism, colonialism, and racism. My point is, none of this is new. The only thing that's new is that all of this has been forgotten.